All right, so I'm coming to you here from the garage, and I figured I'm gonna hang out in here, smoke some cigarettes, because we're gonna discuss the Rhodesian Bush War in its fucking entirety. Now, this is definitely going to be a multi-part video because this is one of the most complex, misunderstood things in history. It's actually my favorite subject overall, closely followed by the Boer War, and that really ties into this subject too. So I'm going to cover basically history. In this part, I'm going to cover the history that led up to the unilateral independence, which is where Rhodesia declared its independence in 1965 from the British Empire. And I'm going to explain what apartheid was in the case of Rhodesia, because apartheid in Rhodesia was different than the one you've heard about the most, which would be the one in South Africa. So, this whole thing starts right around the time of the Boer War. You had this cat by the name of Cecil Rhodes. Name sound familiar? Rhodes, Rhodesia. Anyway, he rolls up on the British government one day and says, "Hey, I've been down to Africa, and there's this area up there that I believe is extremely rich in natural resources. And the only thing you got up there is a couple of tribes, a few Dutch settlers, not really anybody giving a shit, and folks, raising cattle. But I think that I can, if I have your permission, I could go in there and clear the place out, set up a nice colony, and start, digging this shit out of the ground and sending that wealth back home. So what do you say?" The British government at the time was Africa happy, so they said, "Hey, sure." And he received a charter to create the British South Africa Company. And what this was essentially was a small paramilitary force of, soldiers, explorers, miners, things like that, logistics folks, but a small sort of military unto itself. And so they went marching into what ended up being North and South Rhodesia, which was a little bit northeast of the Cape Colony. Sort of in the area, part of it was in the Transvaal that I discussed in my Boer War video. So they went in there and they found two tribes, the Matabe and the Shona, I believe. And these two tribes were at war with each other. So Cecil decides he's going to seize this opportunity, and through a couple of military actions, there was two wars specifically between the British South Africa Company and this Matabe tribe, and he brokered peace with the Shona. It's actually interesting. This is the first time that the newly invented Maxim machine gun was ever used in combat, was during the Matabe Wars. So, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I have no fucking idea how to say it. I'm not African. So So he goes in there. Peace is declared between these folks. They figure, pretty quickly that they're not going to do much with their iron spears against these machine guns and trained soldiers. And what happens after that is actually fairly good. Lands are established for these tribes. Not quite the reservation system that we had in the United States during the Indian Wars. They weren't shuffling them around. And it basically was, let's just all stop killing each other. You guys live over here. You guys live over here. These are your traditional lands. We'll set them aside. All we want to do is come in here. We want to build some farms. We want to mine. We can all live together peaceably. And they do that for decades. So these colonies, North and South Rhodesia, are established. The British South Africa Company goes by the wayside, and this place prospers. And around 1923, the British government has sort of had it with the day-to-day affairs of their colonies, and they more or less start allowing the colony to govern itself. So this continues, and then you get into the 50s. And now I'm skipping over World War II, of course, and World War I and all that shit. And I'm definitely going to get into that in a separate video. So I should do all these videos smoking because it gives me a chance to collect my thoughts when I'm rambling. So what starts happening in the 50s essentially is our good friend, once again, communism. It moves into the Belgian Congo. After World War II, the Belgians and the Germans, their colonies were pretty much abandoned. They didn't have the money or the military resources or anything like that to maintain these places, so they just kind of pulled up roots and dipped. And the Soviets, North Koreans, Chinese, and various other communist powers were happy to fill this vacuum. And they did so by arming people, causing chaos, causing war, and these other colonies surrounding North and South Rhodesia turned into basically hell on earth. It was not a nice place to be. Shortly after, the Portuguese colonies, Mozambique and Angola, which were on the other side, they descended into war too. Same thing, communist, Soviet, and Chinese-backed guerrillas. The Portuguese held on for quite a long time, and I could do a separate video on the Portuguese Bush War because that was pretty. That was a very brutal, disorganized, confusing conflict that could definitely use some clarity. So the 60s come, and at this point, the British government has gotten somewhat liberal. You've got this influence of the United Nations going on. I'll lock that up. And they go to Rhodesia, which is now consolidated. It's essentially just Rhodesia, no longer the North and South. And they say, you see all this shit that's happening around you? It's because you don't let everyone vote. And Rhodesia goes, no, the shit is happening because there's, Soviet and Chinese-backed communists trying to overthrow every government they can. And now, mind you, at this time, there's already started to be terrorist attacks and activities in Rhodesia itself. Two groups, Zanla and Zipra, and I cannot remember what the acronyms stand for, but they were Zanla and Zipra were backed. One was backed by the Russians and one was backed by the Chinese. And when they weren't fighting each other, they were giving the Rhodesians shit. So the government in Rhodesia sees this and goes, if we let everyone in this country vote, we're going to end up with the same shit that happened in Mozambique, the same shit that happened in the Belgian Congo, the same shit that happened in Germany, East Africa. Say hi, Zabu. And so now here's where I want to explain apartheid before I get to unilateral independence. So the first point about apartheid is that it was not put in place by the Rhodesians. It was put in place by the British government. And the reason they did this was the same reason the Boers didn't want to let the British vote when they started moving into the the Zuid-Afrikaan, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State during the Boer War because they didn't want to lose their government power. Um, it's kind of ironic that the British would fight a war over, supposed democracy or majority rule, and then turn around and oppose those same laws, except the opposite, in the countries they just conquered. Imagine that, the British being hypocrites and scumbags. So, the other sort of myth about apartheid, and I'm not talking about South African apartheid, I'm talking about apartheid in Rhodesia because it was different. In order to vote as a citizen of Rhodesia, you had to be either a business owner or a landowner. Those were the only rules. There was no color requirement. You didn't have to be white. It wasn't, it consolidated power with people who stood the most to lose if government went one way or the other, essentially. And there was a great deal of black Africans who were represented in the Rhodesian government. They had a parliament, they had this and that, and there was, sort of caucuses and things like that of the various tribes were represented. It really wasn't as bad as it wasn't as bad as what you're led to believe, I guess, in this sort of justification for what happened later. They vilified the Rhodesians to justify all the bullshit that went on in that country, and they really did get fucked over. And I'm not saying apartheid is right. I'm just saying that their version of it was not this horrible racist fucking thing that everybody makes it out to be. I think that's kind of the opposite in South Africa. They definitely had like a no black folks are allowed to vote bullshit going on down there, but they had their own fucking problems, and that's a whole nother video. So you've got all this going around. You're surrounded by countries that are burning because of communism. You've got terrorist actions in your own country, and the British government comes in and decides that you now have to open up your elections to all of these lunatics. So in response to this, the Rhodesians elect a hardline nationalist prime minister by the name of Ian Smith. He was a fairly incredible man in his own right, and I could almost do a video on this guy because he was a decorated fighter pilot and a World War II veteran. He fought in the Battle of Britain. I think he had Distinguished Flying Cross or whatever the British equivalent is of that, and just all around pretty impressive guy. And he votes, they have a vote in Parliament, and they decide that on 1965 they're going to declare unilateral independence from the British. So we're not going to follow your rules. We haven't had to deal with your bullshit since 1923. We've been on our own, and all of a sudden you're going to come in here and try to fundamentally change our government that we've had for, the past 100 years or so. This is ridiculous. So they declare independence, and that's where the Bush War really starts off. And so that's going to be this is going to be the end of part one, and then part two is going to be the meat and potatoes of the Bush War itself. In that video, I'm going to discuss specific battles, tactics, things like that, because there was a lot of things that happened that were very innovative. There were a lot of things that happened that were horrible, and just a lot of people misrepresented. And I especially want to talk about the black Rhodesian veterans who got fucked over by history. Their story really needs to be told. So I hope I do it justice. So stand by for part two.